What if I told you that stupidity isn't merely the lack of intelligence, but something far more dangerous, capable of turning brilliant minds into tools of chaos? A force that turns ordinary people into threats to society simply because they've stopped reflecting? Imagine a renowned scientist, loaded with degrees, spreading lethal misinformation. A kind-hearted teacher promoting harmful ideas. A loving parent making choices that put their children at risk. These aren't bad people, but smart, well-intentioned individuals who've fallen prey to what Dietrich Bonhoeffer termed the power of stupidity. The scariest part is that this doesn't just happen to others, but to folks like you and me. This goes beyond mere philosophical theory. In 1961, Stanley Milgram ran his famous obedience experiments at Yale University, where ordinary volunteers, under orders from an authority, administered electric shocks they believed were painful and even fatal to another person, despite hearing screams of agony. A staggering 65% went all the way, not out of sadism, but because they'd temporarily ditched their independent moral judgment. That's precisely what Bonhoeffer saw in Nazi Germany, inspiring him to craft one of the most disturbing theories on human nature. But before we dive deeper, ask yourself, have you ever caught yourself believing something just because everyone around you did? Hold that thought as we unpack one of the most crucial psychological insights of the modern era. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wasn't an isolated philosopher in ivory towers, he was a German Lutheran pastor who watched his society radically transform. Born in 1906 into an intellectual family, with a prominent psychiatrist and neurologist father, he trusted in the power of education and rational debate. Yet, as the Nazi Party rose, he saw his faith in human rationality shatter. He observed cultured, educated, religious Germans supporting leaders and policies that clashed with their own values. These weren't ignorant masses manipulated by clever propaganda, but professors, doctors, clergy, and intellectuals actively surrendering intellectually. From his prison cell in 1943, awaiting execution for plotting against Hitler, Bonhoeffer penned his most haunting observation: against stupidity, we are defenseless. Protests or force achieve nothing, reasons fall on deaf ears. What made this chilling wasn't just the context, but its precision. Evil carries seeds of its own downfall, breeding unease and resistance, but stupidity convinces itself it's doing good, making it immune to corrections. Perhaps Bonhoeffer's most prophetic view was how stupidity benefits existing power structures. Malicious folks know they're wrong, creating internal conflicts that lead to eventual collapse. But those trapped in functional stupidity firmly believe in the good they're doing, resisting any fix. This isn't accidental. Power holders no longer need to censor info, they just create environments where honest data processing becomes exhausting. When Bonhoeffer spoke of stupidity, he didn't mean low IQ or lack of schooling, but something more intricate, like functional stupidity or willful ignorance. In his prison letters, he described, "The stupid person is stubborn but dependent. In conversation, it feels like dealing not with a person, but with slogans and catchphrases that possess them." The revolutionary part of his theory was arguing that stupidity arises not from personal flaws, but from systemic pressures making independent thinking tough and expensive. Our economic systems encourage mental shortcuts, social media platforms rake in billions from emotional reactions over critical analysis, news outlets get clicks from outrage, not nuance, politicians win with simple slogans, not complex policies. When people juggle multiple jobs, drown in debt, and face constant info bombardment, intellectual surrender becomes a survival tactic. Economists call it rational ignorance. It's more efficient to stay uninformed on complex issues than invest time in genuine understanding. But this individual rationality breeds collective irrationality, exactly what Bonhoeffer noted in Nazi Germany. The outcome is structural push toward intellectual surrender, and our stressed, overwhelmed brains are primed to comply. While economic systems shove us toward mental shortcuts, our minds are biologically wired to accept them. Leon Festinger's pioneering work on cognitive dissonance in the 1950s showed how the brain fights to reject conflicting info. Bonhoeffer intuited this, and modern psychology confirms, the process ramps up under stress, overload, or economic insecurity, conditions our current systems foster. He noted stupidity thrives in group settings, writing that it's not a psychological issue, but a sociological one. Rational individuals ditch critical thinking when joining larger groups or movements. This idea was ahead of its time. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments in the 1950s proved that, surrounded by a group giving obviously wrong answers, 75% of people conform at least once, even knowing better. Now, consider this in the digital age. Social media algorithms create echo chambers that make this shift easier than ever. A 2018 MIT study found false info spreads 6 times faster than truth on platforms, because falsehoods are emotionally more satisfying than complex realities. By sharing misinformation that reinforces worldviews, people fuel systems rewarding mental shortcuts over careful scrutiny. The algorithm serves more of the same, creating intellectual quicksands. Have you noticed how your social media feed shows exactly what you want? It's no accident, it's the architecture of chosen ignorance at work. This pattern repeats in history. The Salem witch trials weren't by villains, but devout community members convinced they were protecting neighbors. The 1950s Red Scare wasn't for malicious actors, but patriotic Americans sure they defended democracy. In each, smart, educated people swapped critical thinking for group consensus and emotional certainty. If our brains and systems are stacked against us, how do we fight back? Bonhoeffer advocated costly grace, the willingness to think independently, even if painful, unpopular, or risky. But today we know we're battling not just social pressure, but millennia of evolution and billion-dollar algorithms exploiting our mental flaws. On a personal level, cultivate intellectual humility, acknowledging our knowledge is always incomplete and possibly flawed. Actively seek contradicting data to test beliefs, not to self-punish. Concrete practices to resist intellectual surrender include, first, exercise intellectual friction by setting aside weekly time to read solid arguments from opponents to scrutinize convictions. Second, embrace productive ignorance. When absolutely certain, ask what evidence would change your mind. If nothing, red flag. Third, slow your sharing. Before posting online, verify from an independent source for 60 seconds, breaking the algorithmic emotional cycle. Finally, practice saying, "I don't know," when you truly don't. In a world rewarding confident ignorance over humble uncertainty, admitting gaps becomes radical. But personal actions aren't enough. We need structural shifts making intellectual honesty easier and rewarding. Demand social media platforms disclose algorithmic biases and content curation, fund public media literacy campaigns teaching source and evidence evaluation, design platforms rewarding intellectual humility over tribal certainty. Most crucially, economic policies reducing stress and insecurity, freeing mental bandwidth for complex thinking when not fretting over healthcare, housing, and jobs. Bonhoeffer's theory was brilliant for its time, but he couldn't foresee the worst. It's not just moral surrender or social pressure. Modern neuroscience reveals our brains are wired for functional stupidity. He saw Nazi propaganda via newspapers and radio, but we face exponentially worse, social media algorithms knowing precisely how to psychologically manipulate. And now we enter the AI deepfake era fabricating realities. The threat doesn't just grow, it targets human cognition structure. This transcends Nazis or propaganda, it's about your mind's wiring. Our brains evolved prioritizing speed over accuracy, trusting familiar sources, seeking confirmations, ancestral survival traits. The most terrifying, we're all vulnerable, no matter how clever we think. The mechanism is what Bonhoeffer described: under threat and uncertainty, we fall for authoritative explanation simplifying complexities. But the key insight making his warning urgent: we're no longer just facing human manipulation, but AI systems exploiting cognitive vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Every click, pause, and emotional reaction is analyzed and weaponized against independent thought. We saw this in real time during COVID-19, doctors, engineers, lawyers with proven analytical skills spreading debunked vaccine and treatment theories. Not intelligence failures, but intellectual independence lapses under unprecedented pressure. Bonhoeffer paid the ultimate price for not yielding, hanged on April 9, 1945, weeks before Germany's surrender. His last words, "This is the end for me, the beginning of life." His sacrifice defended not just political resistance, but human thought's possibility. He knew that without independent thinking, people become puppets pulled by the strongest force. His final provocation remains relevant: who stands fast? When conformity crushes, independent thinking demands courage, and truth costs more than comfortable lies. Who resists? The answer isn't superior smarts or education, but daily choices for curiosity over certainty, truth over comfort, careful reflection over quick reactions. Not heroic deeds, but everyday practices turning extraordinary when others stop. The tragedy: intellectual surrender feels like freedom. Thinking is hard, uncomfortable to hold contradictions or admit wrongs. Bonhoeffer saw this as humanity's price. In a world profiting from our surrender, self-thinking becomes radical. The most uncomfortable truth: we're all susceptible to functional stupidity. Thinking ourselves immune is the first fall. Intellectual freedom's price is eternal vigilance, not against outer foes, but our own tendency to stop thinking when it gets tough. Bonhoeffer's stupidity theory unsettles because it's spot on. We see smart people believing obvious falsehoods, educated ones making catastrophic choices, well-meaning citizens backing value-contradicting policies. The issue isn't declining intelligence, but systems rewarding mental shortcuts over reflection. But in this grim diagnosis lies real hope. If stupidity is partly chosen, it can be rejected. If structures change. If from cognitive overload, we create thinking-easing conditions. View critical thinking like physical exercise, uncomfortable at first, vital for strength. Just as we don't run marathons untrained, we can't navigate complex info without intellectual discipline. Mental muscles need regular workout or they atrophy. Next time you're absolutely certain, dismissing contrary evidence without thought, or enjoying total answers comfort, recall Bonhoeffer's warning: functional stupidity whispers you already know everything. In that moment, choose: surrender your mind for certainty's ease or take the harder path of intellectual independence. Bonhoeffer's question isn't if we're smart enough to dodge stupidity, but committed enough to think when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, or costly. In a world profiting from intellectual surrender, careful, independent thinking becomes one of the most vital acts. My challenge this week: find a strong belief and research the best counterarguments for 30 minutes. Not to torment or paralyze with doubt, but to practice the intellectual courage Bonhoeffer died for. If it survives scrutiny, hold it confidently. If not, learn conviction versus truth's difference. Human dignity's future may hinge on how we collectively meet Bonhoeffer's challenge. If this text made you question something you thought certain, that's not weakness, it's intellectual courage's start. Share with someone unafraid of deep, uncomfortable thinking. Because in a world designed to profit from intellectual surrender, careful thinking becomes our most powerful resistance. And remember, every choice for curiosity over certainty, evidence over emotion, reflection over reaction not only guards your mind, it defends human wisdom's possibility in an artificial stupidity age. What's one belief you'll question this week? Let me know in the comments. Let's commit to being those who stand fast when everyone else stops thinking.